Now on BBC Radio 4, Free Wales Harmony. The Manchester DJ, producer and record label boss Andy Votel examines when pop music went Welsh.
Well, isn't it a lovely day?
When people think of Welsh language pop music, they probably think of the bilingual bands of the 1990s like this one, Gorky's Zygotic Monkey.
Isn't it a lovely day?
Or maybe the Super Furry Animals. And of course, there's always Catatonia. These so-called cool Cymru bands sang in both English and Welsh, and if you live outside of Wales, they're probably the first bands you ever heard singing in Welsh at all. My name is Andy Votel, and I'm a DJ designer, record producer and label boss from South Manchester. I'm also a huge fan of Welsh language pop music, but the stuff I'm interested in comes from years before the cool Cymru bands broke through. This is the story of a cultural revolution that happened on our doorsteps and the music that made it sing.
It's the story of all minority languages. They will die of natural causes unless there is a deliberate attempt made to boost them.
As long as you're communicating, it doesn't matter really what language you're singing in. It's my mother tongue, you know, and I shouldn't have to apologise for it.
Politics did actually exist in music in a very real way in Wales, you know, and I wouldn't say it existed in England. The political component was actually part of the music.
You've got all these uncut mojo word writers. If they got hold of these stories, it'd be unbelievable because, you know, you read all their articles that they're writing about the English and American outsiders, and they've got nothing on some of these Welsh people.
A large part of my job involves collecting obscure and unknown music from around the world. I worked out at an early age that a good way to amass an individualistic record collection was to leave my comfort zone. So I stopped buying English language music and plundered 6 generations of foreign rock and pop instead. But about 9 years ago, while digging on home turf, I stumbled across a group of old records which I'd never seen or heard before. These enigmatic platters with hand-designed sleeves were devoid of any English language but felt distinctively local. On closer inspection, it transpires that what I initially guesstimated to be Icelandic, Breton or Hungarian recordings were in fact examples of a huge discography of music that had been made less than 100 miles from my very own turntable. These unidentified spinning objects were actually from Wales. This relatively unknown 1960s and 70s discography of the Welsh language pop scene was a treasure trove for a record collector like me. It included everything I loved about idiosyncratic pop music. And just as fascinating was the story behind this music, a tale of politics, passion and a bloody good disco. It seems unbelievable to me that the UK has practically ignored this wonderful collection of music just because it's in a language they don't understand. And the struggle to save that language starts off the whole story.
My grandfather was Welsh-speaking, and he was from Aberystwyth.
Here's Heather Jones, one of the first Welsh pop songbirds to take flight.
And he would take me into the garden, usually, because grandmother didn't like Welsh. She thought it was a backward language. It wasn't encouraged at all, and that's why my father didn't speak Welsh. But it was a general feeling at the time that Welsh was the way backward. You probably all know about wearing the Welsh knot and everything, that if you spoke Welsh in school, you had to wear the Welsh knot, and whoever had it on at the end of the day would get the cane. So it was really frowned upon and looked down upon. It wasn't the way forward.
Rhys from the Super Furry Animals, one of Wales's most successful and diverse pop bands, agrees.
The Welsh language had been banned from public life for about a century at that point. And there was a huge immigration into Wales during the Industrial Revolution, which also partly changed language in the more industrial metropolitan areas. So the rural areas to the west were predominantly Welsh-speaking, and then a lot of the industrial urban areas had almost lost the language.
By the early 60s, the language was quietly dying. The general message was use it or lose it. Dr. Craig Owen Jones from the Welsh Language Pop Department of Bangor University elaborates.
In 1962, Saunders Lewis, the playwright and essayist, broadcast a radio lecture on the BBC called Tynged yr Iaith, The Fate of the Language. He averred that the language would die out by the end of the 20th century if action wasn't taken and soon to ensure that it survived.
Welsh pop music was struggling too. OK, Tom Jones and Shirley Bassey had found success, but there wasn't much else going on. Folk rock hero Meic Stevens.
I was listening to the radio and I was hearing the crap on the radio that the BBC were pumping out. I mean, absolute rubbish. They were just like covers, you know, they were just translating pop songs into Welsh. Really naff recordings, you know, mono recordings, and terribly badly done. You can listen to the early records yourself and you can hear the absolute rubbish.
You and my rhywbeth syml iawn yw dweud fy mod yn meddwl fawr o rhywun fel ti. Ond cariad gad I meto ddweud mai ti yw'r unig un sy'n gwneud fy nghalon yn hi.
It wasn't until as late as 1968 that Wales got its first proper Welsh language pop band.
A Blew, which translates as the Hare, were the first band to make any sustained attempt at creating Welsh language rock music. They were only around for a year, but in that time they undertook 3 tours of Wales, all of which were wildly successful, and released a single, the first Welsh language rock single, Maes B, and it even got played on Radio 1. And the reaction of the panellists on Radio 1 was, "Do you think this gimmick would work?" Which is very interesting. I think that sums up how Welsh language music was looked at in the English press.
The Welsh language didn't even have official status, so it wasn't on road signs or on forms, and you weren't even allowed to speak it at work. In 1965, 2 factory workers were sacked for speaking in Welsh. The flooding of the Welsh-speaking Tryweryn Valley to make a reservoir for Liverpool was the final straw for many.
It was so symbolic that they drowned a Welsh-speaking community. Because the Welsh-speaking communities are so fragile, you know, it's like similar to drowning an ecosystem. You're kind of you're actively destroying a natural habitat of a fragile language. So it's extremely sensitive, and they did it in the most insensitive way. Even though there were lots of protests against it and political insurrection, and they just went ahead building a dam and drowning a Welsh-speaking valley. There's songs like Tryweryn by Meic Stevens, you know, directly inspired by it. Loads of political movements were inspired by Tryweryn as well. Things like the Free Welsh Army and Mudiad Amddiffyn Cymru. The years following Tryweryn galvanised the Welsh-speaking population to try and defend their rights.
Mewn tir o dan a
The formation of Cymdeithas yr Iaith Gymraeg, or the Welsh Language Society, also helped to politicise young musicians.
Large numbers of Welsh language popular musicians in the 60s and 70s and afterwards were members of Cymdeithas yr Iaith. And Cymdeithas yr Iaith were very active in promoting Welsh language music. They would put on gigs, organise concerts, even release records. 2 of the most important members of Cymdeithas yr Iaith were Dafydd Iwan and Hugh Jones, both of whom were singers, and both of whom went on to form Sign Records, one of the most important Welsh language record labels.
Dulme, a fellow record collector and record producer, tells me more.
You've got to begin Welsh pop with Dafydd Iwan. He has had a profound effect on Welsh-speaking culture as a whole. Just because it's sort of like in Russia, you had Alexander Galich doing all the sort of protest stuff. You had Woody Guthrie earlier in America. Then in Wales, you had, you know, the Welsh language movement gathering speed. And Dafydd Iwan appeared sort of like a Marxist wet dream by putting, you know, Welsh propaganda into pop music that was easily digested.
By the late 60s, Dafydd Iwan had established himself as a singer and satirist, heard here on the song Carlo, poking fun at Prince Charles and his investiture as Prince of Wales in Carnarvon in 1969. Many Welsh people felt the investiture had been forced upon them by the English. The depth of feeling was so strong that two extremists even blew themselves up preparing a bomb for the English prince. And Dafydd Iwan embarked on a less violent but still noted protest, reciting a Welsh poem at the 1969 Aberystwyth Eisteddfod, which was attended by Prince Charles.
What I did was to read a poem which had won the chair the day before, and the chair was about Llywelyn, the last Welsh prince. You would weep today, Llywelyn, if you saw this. And I read it, and half the audience started slow hand clapping, and half cheered me on, and they were torn between not wanting to be discourteous to the son of the Queen and showing that they understood our protest as well. So I could really feel the tension.
But the music still fell way short of what was going on in England when it came to the quality of the recordings. If these isolated protests were to have an effect, they needed to have more of a commercial appeal. So Dafydd brought in Meic to help turn Sign Records into Wales's leading record label for cutting-edge Welsh-language pop music. Often dubbed as the Welsh Bob Dylan, Meic was already something of a name in London. He had all the connections. Jimmy Savile helped him get a deal with Decca. He recorded with the pre-Led Zeppelin John Paul Jones and signed a 5-album deal with Warner's. Later in 1971, he would have a rather unfortunate encounter with the greatest guitarist of all time.
Yeah, it was Jimi Hendrix the night he died, yeah. He'd been drinking red wine with me, He'd never drunk red wine in his life before. This has never come out. People don't know about this, There were people from Marmalade with me, Gary was there, Gary Farr, Jimmy Cregan was there. I think Clapton was there. It was in a club called the Scots of St James in Mayfair. And he said to me, "What are you drinking?" And I was drinking Nuit Saint George, just like a Burgundy. And he wanted to buy a round of drinks. I had a bottle and then some bottles came to the table and he was drinking lager or something, some kind of beer. And he just poured the wine into a pint glass, I don't think he'd ever drunk red wine before. But he didn't know how to drink it. But he seemed to be okay, he was all right, The next day, we woke up late, and somebody phoned and said, "Oh, Jimmy's died in the night." Apparently he choked on his vomit or something.
Remind me to never go drinking with Meic Stevens. A star in the making, Meic had all the big industry contacts. So in 1969, he took Dafydd Iwan, fellow Sign Records founder Hugh Jones, and two other musicians, Geraint, Jarman and Heather Jones, down to a state-of-the-art London studio to record Sign Records' first ever single.
All I tried to do was improve the standards, and I knew that you couldn't improve the music until you improved the recording machinery. You had to get it technically more or less all right before you could bloody start, really, couldn't you?
Hugh Jones' song Dur, which means water, another song with a Trewhenyn theme. This was an important departure from previous Welsh language rock. It sounded cool. A series of great releases followed on Sign Records by artists such as Bran, Edward H. Davies and Endaf Emlyn. Here's Mickey Plum, as far as we know, Wales' first Welsh language mobile disco DJ.
Suddenly became alive, and to me, Edward H. Davies, they were a heavy rock band, as heavy as possible. They broke the mould. Suddenly there was a huge awakening. The Welsh language in the music scene from there on to me was no longer corny. It was a big sound.
With the chairman of the Welsh Language Society at the helm of Wales's premier Welsh language rock label, it's no surprise that the music used to fight the cause for saving the language. Here's Dafydd Iwan from Sign Records and a former president of Plaid Cymru.
We knew that the Welsh language had to be officially recognised on road signs and forms and post offices and then eventually in schools and television channels and so on. We were determined, so we sometimes deliberately broke the law, like painting over English-only signs or sitting on post office floors or just blocking pavements and roads.
Gruff Rhys.
Dafydd Iwan would have been jailed for painting over English language road signs or just taking the signs down, so that the chwiltra song Rhaid yw tynnu lawr is about taking down road signs. And that's why there's bilingual signs and train announcements and things in Wales today. It was all because of political activism by radical young people in the late 60s and early 70s.
Rhaid yw ei tynnu lawr, rhai gwyrdd, rhai glas, rhai bach, rhai mawr, cael spanner reili ac arfau diri, ond rhaid yw ei tynnu lawr.
And it didn't stop at road signs. Here's Mickey Plum, a DJ who toured the country playing Welsh language-only discos.
The next battle was for what? A TV station. I remember once as a protest, I was up on the top of the council building in Llangefni, and the cameras and everything came there for the Welsh news at 6 o'clock, whatever. Come 7 o'clock, I got to come down now, I got a disco in Mall tonight. Fast car to take me there. But it was a part of the awakening.
Mickey also found himself hijacking TV transmitter masts, an offence for which he was eventually jailed.
There was 2 of us up there, and in the morning, as the dawn broke, there was the night watchman sleeping on this table. You could see through the window. And he came out in the morning, scratching his hand, and he saw these 2 guys up my mast. I'm the night watchman, why didn't I catch them? Come down! Come down! And we said, no, come down! So if you climb up, we'll bloody piss on you.
All over the world, it was a time of protest music, and I suppose Wales was no different. But although there was a serious message behind a lot of these songs, I do get the sense that some people were also having a bit of a laugh. And not everyone was into the politics side of things anyway. Here's Mike Stevens again.
I wasn't part of that scene, and I didn't feel part of it either. Well, I've never been interested in politics, you know. I just wanted to have a bit of fun, that's all. You know, I mean, all this bloody political shit that was going down, you know. I found it infantile. They were like a bunch of students protesting.
One of the most popular bands was Ibaramenin, consisting of what people call the holy trinity of Welsh language pop. Mike Stevens, Heather Jones and a young poet called Geraint Jarman.
That was the joke, was that we'd dress up and not be ourselves.
Here's Heather Jones.
So he backcombed his hair, Geraint wore weird clothes, and I wore a hat. I would never normally wear a hat and a long dress or something, you know. We decided to take the mick out of ourselves in a way.
Right.
I mean, but people took it seriously.
That was something that was really prevalent. People like Tebbit Poos, who I mean, I've had to pull this record out because I can't really describe Dewey Poo's humour otherwise, but everything on here is in Welsh, and then it just says, we were sitting outside our Welsh craft shop playing our rustic, quaint, homemade Welsh harps when this Englishman, with an I, came up to us and said, hey man, buzz up to my pad and groove in the Uptown Soul Seed man and cut a bug on a groovy record. So we shot him.
And that's Dewey Puss sounds it's difficult.
They're a bunch of pranksters as well.
Yeah, I suppose we were the first, to be fair.
Okay.
Some of us wanted to not take the mick out of the Welsh scene, but just have a bit of a laugh. So it was the Baramenin first. I think we started having a laugh first. Then the Tebbit Poos were a bit further than us, a bit more having a laugh.
Dylan Colomen by Tebbit Poos, or Purple Teapot in English. Things got even more experimental as the 1970s progressed, with the arrival of the concept album. Here's Carol Parry-Jones, a solo singer and former member of the 1970s Welsh language girl group Sidan.
First concept album is one of the best albums ever made, in my opinion. and was a massive influence on my career, and I still listen to it regularly, and that was Salem. Which took that famous painting by Colonel Vosper of the old woman in chapel, and he wrote this masterpiece.
See, concept albums were kind of a dirty word as well in Anglo-American music. There was a few of them.
Yeah.
They went out of fashion very quickly, but you had a real reason to do concept albums, and they were brilliant, from Naya Benaya and Salem and Guthenwyd, and you don't get that in any other culture, especially 100 miles from my house.
It was a weird thing, the concept album, and you're right, we've got tons of mythology and folklore tales that we can just dive into at any given point.
Osian. Gŵr ifanc golygus a hawddgar. Tywysog erin, arweinydd ei bobl. Mae ganddo bopeth o dymuno gŵr ifanc ei gael.
Here's Catatonia's Cerys Matthews.
I think that's what makes it different. You don't just learn a language, you learn a whole cultural treasure trove. And that really informs your work, because you've had some brilliant poets. That was, what Wales liked to do. We like to go to pubs and compete in poetry. I mean, that is incredible, isn't it? And to be aware of that, and then to have that as a sort of like filtering down into the new generations, and to be aware of it, that's a hell of a pistol to be packing.
Whether it was protest music, humorous pop, or Mabinogion concept albums, singing in Welsh in the 60s or 70s could be said to be political. And in some ways, the music of these individuals kept the language issue in the foreground, and it did have an effect. By 1967, BBC Cymru was broadcasting over 300 hours in Welsh. The following year, the Welsh language radio station Radio Cymru was established, and in 1982, the first Welsh language TV station arrived in the form of S4C. It wasn't just the music that had done it, but it certainly played its part, and it didn't stop there. By the end of the 70s, the music began to change with the times. Geraint Jarman was the big star, and he took Welsh into uncharted waters with reggae.
Mi o'n boti'n wir, fod ein cariad ni fel y dydd.
It was like the best music I'd ever heard. And, I was just there at the right time. I was 26 in 1977. So, you had Burning Spear and all them dub albums coming out before, and, all the Jamaican Joe Gibbs stuff, and it was just like, and Welsh people liked it. There was a place for it. And maybe it's because it's like the protest thing. Because in Cardiff at that time, there was a strong Rastafarian movement. They even saw parallels between the Welsh language being suppressed and their own problems.
Welsh identity and language was still very much on the political agenda. December 1979 saw the start of a campaign of burning holiday homes in rural Wales sold to people from England. The campaign stretched into the early 90s, and there were about 220 incidents. Geraint Jarman released the album Fflamau y Ddraig, which means Flames of the Dragon.
It was to make a point that, the villages and the small towns were losing their language, and they were becoming ghost towns. There was bits of the song, flames rising, paying you back.
Back in the late 70s, Geraint Jarman could pretty much pack out anywhere in Wales, but he never really looked towards audiences outside the country, just like all the bands we've heard from so far, really. And not that the English music press would have taken any notice anyway. But that all began to change in the 80s, explains Rhys.
It became to the point where the English language became a phobia, which was a bit counterproductive. You'd get people singing the Welsh National Anthem after concerts. So by the 1980s, there was a generation of people like Rhys who started Anrem, who was a fan of English language punk rock, and they had no phobia towards the English language. They were from Powys, and they were grown up in a Welsh-speaking village, but they were, I've got no problem with English. That's a huge political statement. What? I was like, yeah, I love the English, and even though they sang every song in Welsh, they were kind of starting to taunt the Welsh language establishment of people like Sain, who were dinosaurs by then. It was hugely radical.
David R. Edwards from John Peel favourites Dat Bluggy.
My mother tongue is Welsh, and that's why I wanted to operate in the Welsh language, but with contemporary music, But my culture would be Coronation Street. That's what I was brought up on. It wasn't chapels and Eisteddfods and that sort of thing. We made a point. We used to sing in England in Welsh, and we used to perform on John Peel in Welsh. Maybe we could have been a lot more successful and made an awful lot more money if we'd have sung in English, and got our point across. But money has never motivated me, really.
The explosion of Welsh language bands in the 80s and the early 90s, like Dat Bluggy, Anrefin, Cyrff and Flaps, is another story in itself. This new wave of bands promoted the Welsh language in an entirely different way. Welsh was just their first language, and that's what they were comfortable in singing in. And by the time you get the cool Cymru bands of the 90s, like Catatonia, Gorky, Zygotic Monkey and the Super Furries, these bands were as comfortable in singing in English as they were in Welsh. Emyr Williams, from the legendary North Wales label Angst, and early home to all of these bands, explains.
By the 90s, Welsh as a language had become quite normalised. If you spoke Welsh, it didn't necessarily mean you were a political activist. It meant you were just a person who'd grown up and gone through the education system in Wales. So I never saw it as something that was like a wounded animal. Do you know what I mean? I just thought it was like a real language in a real world. When bands like Gorky's came, they were normally bilingual. And the idea that they would define themselves as just singing in Welsh wouldn't make sense because they weren't that band, and they never were.
The Super Furry Animals Mung LP from the year 2000 reached number 11 in the national charts, a first for the Welsh language. Its success was even mentioned in the House of Commons. It was a landmark moment for Welsh language pop, an album recognised all over the world, but still singled out for its musical brilliance and not just the language it was recorded in. But I do think that the so-called cool Cymru bands owe quite a debt to the early Welsh language pop pioneers of the 60s and the 70s, who blazed a trail for making singing in Welsh accepted in Wales and beyond.
People love the Super Furry Animals, singing in English or Welsh, and it's all okay now. It's all been accepted. Well, I think it's probably because we got what we wanted. We got S4C, didn't we? We've got all these Welsh schools.
The Welsh identity has changed definitely over the last 10 years. I mean, Welsh people aren't generally very confident about their culture, but I think it's more these days with the assembly and things like that people will not look over the border too much, That's the other thing that used to happen all the time. It's like somehow reassurance always used to come from outside, but, I think we're getting rid of that a little bit more now.
Free Wales Harmony was produced in Cardiff by James Hale.